Something extraordinary just unfolded in the Persian Gulf, and the silence from mainstream media should tell you everything you need to know. When Iran's military commanders issued direct threats against the USS Harry S. Truman carrier strike group, the world braced for another chapter in the decades-long standoff between Washington and Tehran. But what happened next reveals a tectonic shift in global power dynamics that most Americans aren't being told about. See, for over 70 years, US carrier groups have operated as floating fortresses of unquestionable dominance, symbols of American military supremacy that no nation dared challenge. That era is ending, and not with the spectacular confrontation the warhawks were hoping for. Instead, we're witnessing something far more significant, a calculated recalibration of regional power that exposes the fragility of America's global military posture. The truth is, what transpired in those tense hours wasn't just about Iran and the US Navy, it was about Russia's strategic positioning, China's economic leverage, and a fundamental question that will define the next decade. Can American military might still dictate terms in a multipolar world? The answer will shock you. Let me start by walking you through what actually happened, because the details matter here, and they matter enormously. The USS Harry S. Truman carrier strike group entered the region with all the usual fanfare that accompanies these deployments. You know the routine by now: Pentagon briefings talking about freedom of navigation, maintaining stability, reassuring allies, the same script they've been reading from since the end of World War II. But this time, something felt different from the very beginning. Iranian military officials didn't just lodge the usual diplomatic protests. They went on record with specific technical threats about their capability to strike the carrier group. We're talking about detailed references to hypersonic missiles, swarm drone tactics, and coordinated attacks from multiple vectors. This wasn't bluster. This was Iran essentially publishing their strategic playbook, and that in itself should have set off alarm bells in Washington. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Truman didn't back down, but it didn't escalate either. It maintained its position, but adjusted its operational parameters in ways that most casual observers wouldn't notice, but military analysts absolutely did. The carrier group's aircraft sortie rates changed, their electronic warfare posture shifted, and most tellingly, their cooperation with regional partners intensified in a very specific way. What we were watching was a carrier strike group operating not as the dominant force dictating terms, but as one player among several in a much more complex game. And that's the story nobody wants to tell you, because it undermines 70 years of American military mythology. Think about what a carrier strike group represents. We're talking about a floating city of 5,000 personnel, dozens of aircraft, billions of dollars in technology, and the most sophisticated defensive systems ever created. For generations, parking one of these off someone's coast was the ultimate power move. It said, without words, we can project force here whenever we want, and there's nothing you can do about it. That calculus has changed, and Iran knew it had changed. And more importantly, the Pentagon knew that Iran knew. This wasn't a case of a regional power getting uppity. This was a sophisticated military force demonstrating that it had studied American carrier operations for decades and developed specific countermeasures that could, under the right circumstances, turn a $5 billion carrier into a very expensive target. The Iranian threats referenced weapon systems that didn't exist 15 years ago. Their Fatah hypersonic missile, if it performs even remotely close to their claims, travels at speeds that make traditional carrier air defense systems look like they're operating in slow motion. Their drone technology has evolved from crude remote-controlled aircraft to sophisticated swarm systems that can overwhelm defensive perimeters through sheer numbers and coordinated targeting. And perhaps most significantly, they've invested heavily in anti-ship ballistic missiles that follow trajectories specifically designed to exploit the gaps in Aegis radar coverage. This isn't speculation. This is based on documented Iranian military developments that Western intelligence services have been tracking and, frankly, worrying about for years. But here's what makes this moment truly pivotal. The unexpected turn wasn't a military confrontation, it was the absence of one, combined with a series of diplomatic and strategic moves that revealed a much deeper transformation in how global power actually operates today. Within 72 hours of the Iranian threats, we saw a flurry of back-channel communications involving not just Washington and Tehran, but Moscow, Beijing, and several Gulf states. What emerged wasn't a climb down by Iran or a show of force by America, it was something far more nuanced, a tacit acknowledgement that the rules of engagement in the Middle East have fundamentally changed, and that American carrier groups, while still formidable, no longer operate with the same presumption of invulnerability they once enjoyed. Russia's role in this cannot be overstated. Moscow has been quietly building its relationship with Tehran for years, not just through arms sales, but through intelligence sharing, joint military exercises, and strategic coordination that gives Iran capabilities it could never develop on its own. When Iranian commanders threatened the Truman, they weren't just relying on their own reconnaissance. They had access to Russian satellite data, Russian electronic warfare expertise, and Russian strategic guidance that made their threats credible in ways that would have been impossible a decade ago. This is the multipolar world everyone talks about, but few truly understand. It's not just about multiple power centers existing. It's about them actively coordinating to constrain American military options in ways that were unthinkable during the unipolar moment of the 1990s. China's economic leverage added another dimension to this crisis that most Americans aren't even aware of. While the military standoff was grabbing headlines, Beijing was quietly reminding several Gulf states about their economic dependencies and the massive infrastructure investments China has made in the region through the Belt and Road Initiative. The message was subtle but clear. Escalation in the Persian Gulf would be economically catastrophic for everyone, and China had both the means and the motivation to ensure that cooler heads prevailed. This is 21st century power politics. It's not about who has the biggest guns. It's about who controls the economic networks, the energy supplies, the financial systems, and the diplomatic channels that can either diffuse crises or make them exponentially worse. The unexpected turn was that everyone involved recognized these new realities and acted accordingly. The Truman stayed in the region, but its operations became more circumspect. Iran maintained its hardline rhetoric publicly while engaging in serious dialogue privately. Russia and China worked behind the scenes to ensure that their respective interests were protected without pushing things toward open conflict. And the American foreign policy establishment had to confront an uncomfortable truth. There are parts of the world where US military power, while still significant, is no longer decisive. That's a bitter pill to swallow for a nation that has built its entire post-World War II identity around the idea of unchallengeable military dominance. Let's talk about what this means for the average American, because these geopolitical chess moves have real consequences for people's daily lives. Every time there's a crisis in the Persian Gulf, oil prices spike. Your gas prices, your heating costs, the price of basically everything that needs to be transported goes up. The volatility in global energy markets that stems from Middle Eastern tensions doesn't just affect traders on Wall Street, it hits your wallet directly. But here's the thing. The old playbook for managing these crises, park a carrier group offshore, rattle some sabers, watch oil prices stabilize, doesn't work anymore. The presence of the Truman didn't calm markets. If anything, it increased anxiety because everyone in the energy trading world understands that a carrier strike group in the Persian Gulf is simultaneously a deterrent and a target, and the calculus of which it is at any given moment has become genuinely uncertain. This uncertainty reflects a broader transformation in how global power operates. We're moving away from a world where one nation, no matter how powerful, can unilaterally impose its will through military force. We're moving toward a world where power is diffused, where regional players have genuine capabilities to resist external pressure, and where the costs of military intervention have become prohibitively high for even the wealthiest nations. The Iraq War cost America trillions of dollars and achieved virtually none of its stated objectives. Afghanistan ended in humiliating withdrawal. Libya turned into a failed state. Syria became a quagmire where Russian intervention proved more decisive than American efforts. These aren't just policy failures, they're symptoms of a fundamental shift in the nature of global power that the American foreign policy establishment refuses to acknowledge. Iran understands this shift better than most, which is why their response to the Truman's deployment was so calculated. They didn't need to actually attack the carrier to make their point. They just needed to credibly demonstrate that they could, and that the costs of such an attack, both to the carrier group and to the broader regional stability that everyone depends on, would be catastrophic. This is deterrence in the 21st century. It's not about matching aircraft carriers with aircraft carriers, it's about developing asymmetric capabilities that make the enemy's strengths irrelevant. Iran has spent decades studying American military doctrine, identifying vulnerabilities, and developing weapons systems specifically designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. Their investment in missiles rather than aircraft, in drones rather than tanks, in cyber warfare rather than traditional electronic warfare, All of this reflects a sophisticated understanding of how to fight a much more powerful adversary without trying to beat them at their own game. The unexpected turn also revealed something crucial about American decision-making at the highest levels. There are serious people in the Pentagon and the intelligence community who understand these new realities and are trying to adapt American strategy accordingly. They recognize that the era of unilateral military action is over, that carrier strike groups are increasingly vulnerable to sophisticated anti-access area denial strategies, and that maintaining American influence in regions like the Middle East requires diplomacy, economic engagement, and multilateral cooperation far more than it requires military displays. But these voices are constantly battling against a different faction. Let's call them the forever war establishment that still believes in the efficacy of military force as the primary tool of American foreign policy. The response to the Iran-Truman crisis showed that, at least for now, the more cautious voices are being heard. Think about the domestic political implications of all this. The American public is exhausted by endless wars. Poll after poll shows that overwhelming majorities want less military intervention abroad, more focus on problems at home. But the foreign policy establishment in Washington operates in a bubble that's remarkably resistant to these democratic pressures. They've built careers, institutions, and entire think tanks around the premise that American global military dominance is both necessary and achievable. Admitting that this premise is no longer viable would require them to fundamentally rethink everything they've spent their professional lives advocating for. So instead, we get this cognitive dissonance where the military continues deploying carrier groups to regions where their presence is increasingly provocative rather than stabilizing, while simultaneously developing contingency plans for scenarios where those same carrier groups might be overwhelmed by adversaries using weapon systems that cost a fraction of what the carriers cost to build and operate. The economic dimension of this deserves much deeper examination. America spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined. That's not an exaggeration, it's a literal fact. But what are we getting for that investment? The carrier strike group that faced off with Iran represents decades of accumulated military spending, research and development, training, infrastructure, and yet Iran, a country with an economy smaller than Texas, has developed capabilities that can credibly threaten that entire investment. This isn't a failure of American military technology. It's a structural reality of modern warfare where defenders with sophisticated weapons can impose costs on attackers that make traditional force projection economically unsustainable. Every missile Iran fires might cost a few $100,000. Every missile the carrier group fires in response costs millions. Every aircraft lost costs tens of millions. Every sailor's life is priceless. The mathematics of this kind of conflict don't favor the carrier strike group, and everyone involved in the crisis knew it. Russia and China are watching all of this very carefully, learning lessons that will shape their own military strategies for decades to come. If Iran can successfully deter American military action through asymmetric capabilities and strategic partnerships, then what's to stop other regional powers from following the same playbook? We're already seeing it happen. North Korea has developed nuclear weapons and long-range missiles specifically to deter American intervention. China is building out its navy and developing anti-ship ballistic missiles explicitly designed to keep American carriers away from Taiwan. Russia has invested heavily in electronic warfare, cyber capabilities, and long-range precision weapons that can threaten NATO assets without engaging in direct conventional warfare. The pattern is clear. America's potential adversaries have studied American military strengths and have developed strategies specifically designed to neutralize those strengths without trying to match them dollar for dollar. The unexpected turn in the Iran-Truman crisis was really a crystallization of trends that have been building for years. The multipolar world isn't coming, it's already here. Regional powers have agency in ways they didn't during the Cold War or the unipolar moment. Military force is no longer the trump card it once was in international relations, and American leaders are being forced to navigate a world where their traditional tools of statecraft, military deployments, economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, are producing diminishing returns. This doesn't mean America is in decline, necessarily. It means American power has to be exercised differently, more carefully, with more attention to the constraints imposed by a complex international system where other players have real capabilities and real options. What happened next, after the initial crisis subsided, tells us even more about where things are headed. The Truman eventually completed its deployment and left the region without incident. Iran claimed victory in deterring American aggression. American officials claimed they had successfully demonstrated resolve and maintained freedom of navigation. both sides declared success, which is usually a sign that everyone backed down from the brink. But the real outcome was more subtle and more significant than either side's propaganda would suggest. What we witnessed was a tacit negotiation about the terms of engagement in a region that has been contested for decades. America learned that carrier deployments alone won't cow Iran into submission. Iran learned that threatening American military assets brings consequences, even if those consequences aren't kinetic. And everyone learned that managing these tensions requires ongoing communication, mutual understanding of red lines, and acceptance that no single party can dictate outcomes unilaterally. This is the new normal, and we'd better get used to it. The age of American hegemony, if it ever truly existed, is over. We're entering an era of complex interdependence where military power, economic leverage, diplomatic skill, and information dominance all matter, but none of them alone is sufficient to achieve strategic objectives. The countries that will thrive in this environment are those that can master all these dimensions of power simultaneously. The countries that will struggle are those that rely too heavily on any single tool, whether that's military force, economic sanctions, or diplomatic isolation. America has enormous advantages in this new landscape: a dynamic economy, world-class universities, technological innovation, strong alliances, global cultural influence, but it also has weaknesses: political polarization, crumbling infrastructure, social inequalities, a foreign policy establishment that's slow to adapt to new realities. The Iran-Truman crisis should be a wake-up call, but I'm not optimistic that it will be. Too many powerful interests are invested in maintaining the status quo, in pretending that carrier strike groups still provide the same level of deterrence they did in 1995. Too many careers depend on never admitting that the emperor has no clothes, that American military dominance is eroding in ways that make traditional shows of force increasingly counterproductive. But reality has a way of asserting itself regardless of what we want to believe. The next crisis will come, and the limits of American military power will be tested again, and eventually we'll be forced to have the honest conversation about what role military force should play in American foreign policy in a world where we can't simply impose our will through superior firepower. That conversation is long overdue, and the sooner we have it, the better prepared we'll be for the challenges ahead.